Hello everybody. I'm sitting here with my good colleague Ben Jones, Dr. Ben Jones, and I'd just like to acknowledge that we're out on the land of the Darumbal people, and we acknowledge that they are the custodians of these lands, past, present and emerging, and their good custodianship of it. Today I'd like to talk about this great book which I've been dipping into. I'll just hold it there. And Australia on the world stage, it's interesting, you know, every country will want to write their own history. What is interesting is, what is that history on bigger stages or smaller stages? And Ben's put together this great book, and we'll focus a little bit on his contribution to the book, especially his chapter. And so I'll start, you know, it's quite a wide-ranging book. You're talking from everything from the First Nations to this kind of, you call it post-Federation history and foreign relations. And you could kind of say, is this a book that is just for these hardcore historians?
Thanks, Stephen. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I certainly hope it's not a book just for hardcore historians. The editors and I have tried to be deliberately interdisciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of Australian histories that follow a general formula of having a small, sometimes even tokenistic mention of First Nations, and then colonisation, 19th century, Federation, Australia in the 20th century, and sort of ticking a number of boxes along the way. So this book deliberately brings in international relations experts and historians because, one, I think there's just value in general with peering over the disciplinary wall and seeing what your colleagues are up to, but also because I think historians tend to ask different questions, and IR scholars ask different questions, and they're both valuable. Historians sometimes are too concerned with not making a false analogy, and often when people say, oh, well, this thing happening in history now, oh, this is just like back then, historians jump up and down and say, no, I can tell you 10 different reasons why, but there may still actually be a lot of validity to the comparison. And IR scholars sometimes fall into the trap of anything, you know, more than a year old. It's ancient history because the president has changed, or in some cases the borders have changed. Whereas historians approach it by saying, yes, but how did we get there? And we just had a really fruitful unofficial symposium with historians and IR scholars talking together about how Australia got to where it is now and where it might go in the future. And that really is the genesis of the book.
I love that. And then you have this lovely opening question, which in a way it sets the agenda. When and where is Australia? Unpack that for me.
Well, I think these are questions that sometimes get simplified to our detriment. And people like to think, well, when is Australia? Well, obviously that was 1901, or sometimes obviously that was 1788. And that one in particular is problematic because if you asked Philip and his fellow travellers starting a convict colony in Sydney, are you founding Australia today? Of course they would have said no. And a question I throw to my students often is, when did Australia become independent? And sometimes they say, well, at Federation, surely. I'm like, well, no, it's more complicated because Britain still oversaw the foreign affairs. And they say, well, maybe the Statute of Westminster, but then why did Australia feel obliged to follow British directions and to enter wars that Britain did? And there are all these different dates, and the uncomfortable truth is there isn't really one set point when Australia becomes Australia, but that's all just talking about modern history. We also go back thousands of years before colonisation in the book as well, and ancient Australia has an incredible history as well, and we've got a wonderful Wiradjuri author, Lawrence Bamblin, who talks a bit about that. And so And where is Australia is one where people may think, well, that's obvious as well. But again, people conceptualised Australia really as just being the southeast corner, and New Zealand was probably part of that conception of Australia for most of the 19th century. And so if there's a point in this exercise, it's pushing against this idea that there's a teleological view of Australian history, that it's just set, here's the clean starting point and the evolution, that a lot of the events that happened were by chance, by random. Australia could have ended up having multiple European colonisers. It could have not been colonised at all. There are all sorts of different Australias that were possible, and the one that we have isn't predetermined. It's the result of various forces of history, but also where Australia may go in the future isn't set either, and it's something that those who care about the future of Australia should think about deeply, because it is something we can change and we can shape.
I also think that a key point in this book, and that speaks to your chapter, is about this whole idea of foreign relations. And you talk about that also is something which changes and everything. So talk me through, did Australia suddenly have foreign relations as something? I mean, what is the evidence that you could fix that in a certain period that we gradually formed that?
Well, I think overwhelmingly, certainly IR scholars tend to only think of when Australia first started sending its own diplomats to Washington and London and to Tokyo and various other places. But we mentioned in the introduction that the archaeological record, we are learning more and more every year about how vast Australia's ancient history is and how much Indigenous and First Nations foreign relations were going on. And just one example we use in the introduction is that there are pottery shards off Lizard Island, which is well over 30 kilometres off the coast of Queensland. And so there were incredible sea voyages going on well before European seafaring managed to get here. It's already well known that the First Nations of Northern Arnhem Land had trade with the Macassans in what's now Indonesia. So Lawrence Bamblett's chapter unpacks some of that, but it also suggests maybe there's still something we could learn about First Nations best practice. And another Wiradjuri author in the book, James Blackwell, is really a pioneer in this space of First Nations foreign relation. It's a question which I don't think many Australians have thought about, what a First Nations opinion or perspective. And it throws in interesting questions, like when Australia today sends trade delegations, should we, as a matter of protocol, have a First Nations person with them and to show the cultural practices of Australia's First Nations?
It reminds me of an analogy of when the Renaissance came. Suddenly Europe woke up to the idea that they actually had to train people who could actually have conversations because they were doing trade. And before that, it implies people didn't train in this. So there's a whole space here of how do you learn about what is acceptable international relations. And I think that puts Australia very much in that space of we want to interact with other cultures, and that requires a change in our mindset, which brings me to the next question. Is you talk here about a change almost in national identity, how we think of ourselves, and you talk about an old Australia and a new Australia in the second half of the 20th century. Is this some kind of thinking differently about ourselves, and how does that play in with your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suggest it is such a dramatic shift, you almost could think of it as two different countries. Every nation between 1901 and 2001 is different, of course, because many changes happened over that century, and of course many nations didn't exist until the middle of the 20th century. But Australia is remarkable in the sense that the national identity itself changed from British Australian to just being Australian. And the historian Keith Hancock put it beautifully in the 30s, which is still when Australia had this British Australian identity. He said it's unusual to be in love with two soils, because patriotism is usually a jealous mistress, but that seems to be what has happened in Australia. But then when you think about it, from federation, you have a nation of people predominantly identifying as British Australian, and so they're going to put a constitution together that reflects that. They're going to create a flag that reflects that. They're going to put all of these symbols, statues, the names of roads and things. And then in the second half of the 20th century, when Australian national identity had this complete evolution to now just see Britain as an ally, as a country we are close with, but not as, we don't think of ourselves as British unless we happen to, actually be British as well. The question is, well, do we go back to the Constitution then? Do we go back and look at the flag and some of these symbols, and do we want to have national symbols that better reflect who we are now, not who we were in 1901?
You've got this lovely phrase which I think summons up some of these kind of dilemmas and challenge about who we are and who we identify with. And it goes along the lines of, the language of Britishness is gone, but the privileging of Britishness remains. What does that mean?
I think what I'm trying to get across there is that no Australian politician would say, I'm British to the bootstraps, as our most successful Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, said. But there still is something in our psyche, or at least in some of us, when people suggest something like, maybe we shouldn't have a British flag in the position of honour in our flag, that makes them just halt for a minute. And sometimes, because that language of singing Rule Britannia and having Empire Day is gone, they don't quite know how to articulate why they're opposed to that, or why they're opposed to cutting the final tie with the British monarchy. But there's just this sense that even if we're multicultural, that Britain is still the first of all the other immigrant groups to come here. And that's something the book challenges, or I hope challenges, and something I hope people consider. I suppose especially people who might instinctively think, well, I like things the way they are, to think about, well, why is that? Is it just because that's the tradition I grew up with, and that is the Australia of 1901, but is that the Australia I want to see in, for the next 100 years?
So if you were looking at your chapter and the book as a whole, would you be challenging or prompting new debates about the future direction of Australia?
Well, I hope so. I mean, that's a lofty goal, and I don't want to presume it for myself, but certainly with my chapter, if it's titled it's titled To Almost Republic, and that's sort of where Australia left itself in 1999, with a vote where, even though it failed, 45% of people said they wanted to become a republic then, which at least means that the British royal family is no longer a unifying, just universally loved. There's significant dissent, and a lot of polls before and since then have said a majority of Australians, particularly now with King Charles, would prefer Australia to become a republic. So I certainly don't make a case for a republic in that chapter. I try to, as honestly and objectively as I can, chart the national mood in that second half of the century. But if it ends with people or readers thinking, well, what's the next step now, then I'll be satisfied with that.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent introduction to, let's call it, some of the opportunities of where the nation goes, but also about the identities we create. Thank you very much, Ben.